Welcome to Scandal Water, where the tea is hot and the conversation lively.
Your hosts, Candy
And Ashley,
will discuss a peculiar story somehow related to the entertainment industry. This podcast might not change the world, but it just might satisfy your thirst for an intriguing tale.
Oh, it's that time of day. Tune in and hear what the ladies say. It's time to bend your ear when the silver screen appears. Stories about the stage and screen and everything in between. So come on and join the fun. The curtain opens in 3, 2, 1.
Hello, Ashley.
hello.
We are back to talk more about Chernobyl. I cannot wait to have this discussion with you. I'm so excited. If you guys have not yet heard part 1, make sure you go back and listen to that first because we kind of laid the foundation.
This won't make a lot of sense.
It won't, but it'll still be fascinating.
Yes.
But I thought I would start part 2 with 5 fast facts.
Oh, I love it.
Yeah.
Let's have them. And do it fast. No, I'm just kidding.
Oh, really fast. Okay. To this day, Chernobyl remains the worst nuclear accident in history. Can you believe that?
Well, it was pretty bad.
It was, yeah. Several higher-ups and liquidators, we defined that term in the last episode, mentioned in their personal accounts that they were made to sign non-disclosure
I bet
agreements. We touched on this last time as well. When the residents in the evacuation zone were notified they had to leave, according to several first-person accounts, they were told it was going to be just a few days.
Yeah, they just left their stuff and thought they'd be back, and they never went back.
They thought it was like a day off. I mean, like in some ways, it was kind of like a little bit of a party.
Yeah.
So they were instructed to pack their important documents, a little food, and just what they thought they might need for maybe 3 days. They were told to leave everything else behind, including their pets. Never dreaming they would not come back. They said people would beg, like, can I go back and get my pet? They would, no.
I can't.
It was
I
so
just don't know.
dangerous.
I'd have to sneak them out. I'd have to get my little pet carrier and be like, this is my important document. I have them in there with my pet. And I'm not blaming the people. They didn't know.
No, they had no idea.
Nobody had any idea.
They were following, I mean, this had never happened before. The government is telling them, get on these buses. We're taking you out of this area. It's 3 days. Leave this, take this. And they did what they were told. Yeah. But an interesting, rabbit trail for just a second. A quote from a 2021 National Geographic article hit me. It said, but even as tens of thousands of people were being evacuated from homes to which they would never return, tens of thousands of others were arriving. Most came under orders to work on decontamination, others came for science, and still others defied the orders to stay away and moved back to their villages as soon as possible. That was never in my mind to think about all these people leaving and then
Others came in.
Here are these others who are being ordered to risk their lives to come help, or some people just were like,
I'm going back.
I can't stay away.
There was that older lady in the episode that refused to leave, right?
Yes, and he shot her cow.
I know. I can't.
Well, in 2018, 15 puppies were the first animals or objects allowed to leave the nuclear exclusion zone since its creation in 1986.
And when? 2015?
2018.
2018.
15 puppies. They kept testing the levels because they killed as many. I mean, they tried, because of the radioactivity and everything, they killed as many pets as they could. But some of the animals, in particular dogs, survived. And over the years, they have monitored them. And these puppies were found to have low enough radiation levels finally that they got to leave and have happy homes. And the last fast fact. Radiophobia is the excessive and unreasonable fear of radiation.
I don't think it's excessive or unreasonable.
Well, it is actually a thing. Apparently, psychologically, some people became so concerned about it that they would think, oh my gosh, radiation is everywhere. But what they brought out was, after Chernobyl, I mean, think about how many hundreds of thousands of people were exposed. Whenever they would complain of something, so many of them were told their diagnosis was radiophobia. You're imagining it.
And it was real.
Oh, yeah. Yes. This was on the lost tapes. So many people were saying, here we are with these terrible things happening to us and feeling terrible and whatever the symptoms might be. You have radiophobia.
Oh my gosh.
Yeah.
That happened to the radium women too. They were told, no, it's just a headache. It's just it's just arthritis. You're fine.
Right. Yes. Well, let's talk about the impact of Chernobyl.
The original event or
The actual event.
Okay.
Yes. Thank you for the clarification. A Newsweek article published in 2019 said this about the death toll. For all the disruption, the official Soviet death toll for the accident stands at just 31.
That's can't be true because of all the cancers and everything.
This was really getting me. It says this comprises the 2 people killed immediately by the explosion and irradiation, plus the plant workers and first responders who were exposed to fatal doses of radiation in the days, weeks, and months after, as cleanup operations got underway. In 2008, a report by the UN Scientific Committee on the Effects of Atomic Radiation revised this tally up to 54, including those who died as a direct result of trauma or radiation sickness sustained during 1986 and 1987. This includes, for example, the crew of a helicopter that crashed while trying to drop decontaminating mixture onto the open reactor from above. To this day, if you look up stats for how many died, this is what you see. But the article goes on to point out all the people whose health was impacted by the radiation, even though they continued to live. The point that they make in the article is that we don't really know. Nobody is really sure just how many people did die somehow related to what happened to them at, their exposure from Chernobyl, the cancers that they developed as a direct result of this. That you don't know. Different groups have put out their predictions. One group, the Chernobyl Forum, their estimate is about 4,000 to 7,000 may have died as a result of the exposure. The Union of Concerned Scientists estimate is that it could be as much as 27,000 people. Greenpeace suggests that maybe 200,000 people or more may have died as a result of cancers caused by Chernobyl.
Yeah.
You have no idea. Again, we've said this before. Many sources say it was something like 600,000 people who were exposed to the radiation because they were brought in as part of the cleanup operation. They were liquidators. Again, some people say that number might have been more like 750,000. But you also have the residents who weren't evacuated very quickly. They weren't told,
they weren't told to leave.
Right. So an interesting article I saw.
And then you have the people in the other towns.
Yes.
They're not even being tracked.
Perfect segue. Because, in fact, I was getting ready to move to a different article. It's a BBC article that talked about that point exactly. There is a science historian at MIT named Kate Brown who was doing some research on Chernobyl and kind of following what happened, the impact of it afterwards. And she did a lot of research, looked at documents, went to different places, did interviews, all kinds of stuff. But she found that there was this wool processing plant about 50 miles from Chernobyl, different town altogether. It was outside the evacuation zone, and they did go into that town. They checked at a few different spots what the radiation levels were. That town seemed to be doing okay, so everybody just rolled on. They were not evacuated. These people just went on about their everyday lives. Again, some of the people doing this were these women, because they were pretty much all women who were working in this wool processing plant. These women would work 12-hour shifts. They were very hands-on. They had to sort the raw fleece. They had to, they were involved with getting it ready to be washed and baled. They would have to carry it.
Did these sheep come from the area?
That's the thing. These
so it's
women
like the radium women
started getting sick. The BBC article said, quote, some suffered nosebleeds, others complained of dizziness and nausea. When the authorities were called to investigate, they found radiation levels in the factory of up to, I don't know how to read that, 180 MSV per hour. Anyone exposed at these levels would exceed the total annual dose considered to be safe in many parts of the world today in less than a minute.
Oh, gosh.
Yeah. So Kate Brown's research found that 298 of the women were found to have radiation levels that were as high as what the liquidators from the early days of cleanup were showing.
And so it was in the sheep?
What they finally came to conclude is they think, yes, these animals had been exposed to radiation. It was in their wool. And then when these women would be handling the wool, carrying it around, hugging it up against their bodies, they were absorbing all this radiation. So the point then is Kate suspects that so many more people were impacted than we even suspect. And again, part of this is because the state was working so hard to keep everything quiet.
Yeah.
In this article, this again is her opinion, but she says, quote, "In hospitals throughout the region and as far away as Moscow, people were flooding in with acute symptoms. The accounts I have indicate at least 40,000 people were hospitalized in the summer after the accident, many of them women and children." So that's just the summer after. You know, who knows how long
the impact was.
Right, because we know even from some of the people that we did follow who we know were exposed, they didn't die for maybe 2 or 3 years or 4 years. So it's not like everything happened immediately unless the radiation exposure was very strong
extreme. And very
Yeah.
immediate.
If you didn't see part 1, there's a documentary. It is called Chernobyl, The Lost Tapes. And that is where they have actual footage and people sharing their personal accounts. And in that, we do hear from and see as health care workers are talking about the impacts that they personally saw. There's this one woman talking about how many more thyroid cancer incidents they were finding in babies.
Yeah.
In babies. You saw some mutations, so many more complaints from people about illnesses and things they were experiencing that they'd never experienced before. And again, so many of them were told radiophobia.
Gosh.
Yeah. So let's talk about some of the accuracies versus what might have been fictionalized a little bit.
Okay.
We've been touching on that, I know, a bit as we've gone
With the
on.
characters.
Yeah,
You talked about that with the characters.
But it has been really valuable for me. I can't say it enough. Those tapes, that was really powerful. Lots of sources I've read, articles and things, and the portion of the book that I've read, all of those have been very helpful in trying to help me figure out what might have been taken liberties with versus what was actual. I think I said this in part 1, but those lost tapes, I am convinced 100% that is where we got the whole story of Ludmilla, who was the wife, pregnant with a child.
So sad.
Yeah, and her firefighter husband. Now, here's the thing, though. Even within her story, which parallels so closely what's in the miniseries, I know that's 100% where he got it. I mean, even the name, right? But in reality, she already had children.
Oh.
So see, sometimes they would fictionalize even the details.
Because it made it more powerful if she didn't have children.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
If this was the first child.
Exactly. And something that was in the lost tapes that I'm sure it was narrative economy. They didn't have time to go there. But in the lost tapes, she shared that her husband, because he was so strong and healthy, a lot of the other firefighters were not, and they passed very quickly, relatively speaking, like within a few weeks. Her husband was one who they tried something with. Apparently, remember, the Soviet Union was very concerned about how they were perceived by the other countries. This was a huge smear on their name. They were very concerned about all this. And so apparently the U.S. had reached out at one point saying they wanted to offer some help medically. And they had brought in this surgeon who was supposed to be really good from the U.S. And he was going to try to help deal with some of their most serious radiation cases. Yes. The comment made by somebody, I don't know if it was Ludmilla who did speak on this documentary, or if it was somebody else, but the comment was made that they didn't know, the U.S. didn't know that he was set up for failure. They only gave him the hopeless cases. Oh. So everybody he worked on was going to die. Oh. But apparently, I believe it was this man who tried to do a bone marrow transplant on Ludmilla's husband, and it didn't work. But my point is, even in this incident, clearly based on a true story, so many details that are accurate, but there still were pieces of it that were different, right? Now, one of the sources that I found was a 2019 BBC article entitled "Chernobyl Survivors Assess Fact and Fiction in TV Series," and it shares insights from this survivor. He was an engineer named Alexei Bros, who worked in the control room of the number 4 reactor. That's the place where it all went down. Zero. Yeah, he was not there that night, but he says he was on his normal work duty was the next morning. His shift starts. He said he pulls up that day, has no idea anything has happened, and suddenly he's in the middle of it all because like they're in the frenzy of what are we going to do? This is what's happened. So he shares his recollections not only in this article, but also in the lost tapes. And I also found a 2019 Business Insider article where the former deputy director of the Chernobyl power plant, Alexander Kovalenko, gives his opinion about the accuracy of the miniseries. He was called in to help with the containment process. I think it said a few months after the explosion, so I don't know if he was there right away. But here are a few things that these different survivors from these different sources have said. So again, we mentioned this. The men who went into the basement to close the valves, help drain that water, they all three survived for quite some time.
Yes.
One of those survivors himself said that he thought the portrayal of their situation was pretty accurate, except that he said their faces were only partially covered with respirators because they had to speak to each other. He said they were not given a reward and that nobody clapped when they returned because he said it was just our work. Who would applaud that?
Yeah.
That engineer that I mentioned who came in the morning after, he suspects the Bridge of Death story is kind of a myth that has evolved over time. He said because it was the middle of the night, most people slept through it. There weren't that many people who wanted to get up in the middle of the night and come watch if they did know about it.
Right.
So he thinks that's been kind of blown out of proportion a bit over the years.
It is dramatic, though.
Oh, it is, yes. That deputy director I mentioned, Alexander Kovalenko, he did feel that the series more or less reflected the drama of the situation, although he said in real life it was much worse. The engineer also agreed it did a pretty good job of conveying the emotions and the mood of the people involved and how powerful it was in terms of being a global catastrophe and how...
Global catastrophe, yes.
And the masses of people that got caught up in it. Deputy Director Kovalenko said that he felt there was a little bit of misrepresentation making Valery Legasov into this big hero. He said, which is actually something I saw in the book and the part I've read so far, that nuclear science was really not Valerie's thing. He was more of a chemist. And he said he certainly did his job and pulled his weight, but he felt that other scientists were more instrumental.
Maybe his story was just the most compelling narratively.
Maybe. A point of disagreement. Here's the big one. These survivors I've mentioned spoke specifically to the issue of the fellows who were put on trial, the fellows who were held responsible. One of those, again, being the guy who was kind of the villain of the story.
Mr. Mustache.
Anatoly Dyatlov. Now, the engineer said that this was not a fiction, but a blatant lie. He said, quote, their characters are distorted and misrepresented as if they were villains. They were nothing like that.
Okay.
He says in an interview that Anatoly Dyatlov was intimidating. He said people were afraid of him, and when he was there, it created tension. But he went on to add, but no matter how strict he was still a high-level professional. In the lost tape, a different survivor seems to agree that the men who were put on trial did not really deserve this. He offered the opinion that the only reason the party put these men on trial, and again, it was 6 people, not 3, as it would appear in the miniseries, was to keep everyone from realizing that it was the government's fault.
Yeah.
Like they had let this whole issue with the faulty emergency shutdown
They
button.
had to have a patsy.
Yep, they needed scapegoats.
Yeah.
So they felt like the whole thing was kind of this PR thing to keep the egg off their own faces.
That would make sense.
Now, the former deputy director is the one who sees it differently. That's Alexander Kovalenko. He said that, and this was a Business Insider article, he felt that Dyatlov was responsible. Like, yes, he admits that there was the faulty equipment. Yeah, that's an issue too. But he thinks there was a human factor. He said Dyatlov was in a hurry to become the boss. He called him an arrogant narcissist. And he basically, I think, was the one who probably gave the version that Craig Mazin used in the miniseries.
Yeah.
Because it sounded like this is the guy who saw it that way.
It's the most creative, too.
Yeah.
It would lend itself to the best television.
Absolutely. To have a villain is more compelling. Yeah. And so in terms of the survivors' input, the last thing I'll bring up is a negative that engineer Bruce said about this was the miniseries, was that he felt there were some stereotypes. In fact, his quote is, there are many stereotypes shown, typical of Western portrayal of the Soviet Union.
Aww.
A big cup, vodka, KGB everywhere.
Wait, a big cup? Do they use big cups in the Soviet Union? Is that a thing?
I'm not sure. That was his quote. I don't
All right.
even know what it means.
Okay.
But yeah, he said, now I'm paraphrasing. Even so, he said he was still happy to see how much attention the show brought back to Chernobyl because he does feel like it's an important topic to discuss and for people to think about. But that leads me to something I saw in a few different sources were reports that the leaders in Russia were not so happy with this American portrayal of the story. I don't know if anything ever came of it, but back in 2019, some of the sources printed said there was a plan to make a show about Chernobyl told from the Russian perspective. And reportedly, it might place some of the blame, or maybe all of the blame, I don't know, on the CIA for having some role in the disaster.
What? Oh, I am interested.
So supposedly there are reports that they found some intelligence people on site that day that were from
America,
is what I understand. I did not do a deep dive, but that's what I recall seeing in a couple of articles.
Interesting.
Well, let's take a break, and when we come back, we'll talk about what happened to some of our key players after the trial.
Ooh, okay. Tornadoes, asteroids, nuclear meltdowns. Just when you thought you'd survived this month's disaster episodes, we're back with one more.
For June's minisode, we make it personal, discussing all manner of disasters, from real-life Good Samaritan videos to our own brushes with natural events to the disaster movies we will never watch. And why.
With your membership to Scandal Water Podcast through either Patreon or Buy Me a Coffee, you will not only be able to join us for this mini-sode, but also all our other bonus content. Most are audio only, but a few are video.
Visit our website, scandalwaterpodcast.com, and become a Scandal Water member today. And we are back. You know what I should say from the beginning? We're going to talk a little bit about what happened to some of our main characters, if you will, since we're talking about this in a miniseries, but they're real life people. So
sure,
we'll talk about what happened to some of our key players. We may give some spoilers. You probably noticed that as we've been talking through, goodness, what's it been? An episode and a half so far. We've tried to avoid telling you certain things in case you're planning to watch the miniseries and you don't want, things to be given away. But as we talk through this part, there probably will be some spoilers in case you want to skip ahead a little bit. So we have purposely not said this, but if you watch the miniseries, something you learn immediately right at the top of episode 1 is what happens to the main character, Valerie.
Yeah,
it is so sad.
It is. Doesn't he feed his cat?
He feeds his cat. He puts out extra food out. Well, first you see him take the little tapes that he has recorded and he puts them somewhere hidden for somebody to pick up, you assume, and then he takes his own life. This is accurate. He did die by suicide. It actually occurred on April 27th, 1988. It was one day after the second anniversary of the accident. And according to, it was a Cosmopolitan article from 2019 talked about what happened to some of these people afterwards. And so I'm pulling a lot of this from Cosmo. But they said that it was one day before he was due to announce his results of the investigation into the causes of the disaster. So they think the timing was important.
That he didn't want to do the announcement?
Well, and I'm trying to remember the details because I saw this come up in other sources as well. But I think what had happened was he was dealing with medical issues, his health.
Which he knew he would.
He knew he would. I think there were health issues. It looks as though he's a single man in the miniseries, but in reality, he was married and he had at least one daughter.
Oh.
Because she commented on what was happening. He took some criticism when he came back. He was trying to get some things out. He was having a hard time getting things told. I think there was just, I don't know, some frustration, some depression, some...
I can see why.
Yes, and I think this was his way also of making sure that he was heard, because my understanding is he did put out his story. He did have these tapes, and after this happened to him, it helped. Like, it helped get the word out.
That's kind of what I thought after I watched it. I felt like he did this maybe for personal reasons, but almost more for the, and this is just my opinion, almost more for the greater good so that the story would get out and be taken seriously. That's the impression I was left with after seeing the miniseries.
And I do think that was a factor based on what I saw. Side note, this is so random, but thinking about the way it was portrayed in the miniseries and remembering what his apartment looked like, the way it was conveyed. As we were watching it, Kirk commented like, "Oh my goodness, look at this. This is a guy who had such a really high up job and he was such an important scientist and all that. Look how modest his apartment is." That was actually a comment that somebody made, one of the survivors made in one of the sources, was that's an inaccuracy that in that time period in that country that you would see such a disparity between the people who had some power and who had some leadership and whatever, and the people who were your everyday workers. And they said that was a little unrealistic because he should have had a much fancier,
maybe like they were trying to make him look like one of the regular folk.
Yeah, and maybe that was also after whatever happened, he'd come down a little bit in stature. Maybe that was a way of conveying that. Yeah. I'm not sure, but he had a sad end.
He did.
That's what happened to Valerie. Boris died at age 70 in Moscow in 1990. So he made it 3 years, basically, because I think they wrapped up their work around 1987, I want to say. So he made it a few years beyond that.
One of the conversations, and because you've seen it sooner than I have, I thought it was such a well done conversation between the two of them. Wasn't he looking at a caterpillar on his hand?
Yes.
And he asks him, how long do we have? And he said 2 to 3 years, probably, because they had been so integral and there every day. The scientist was telling him, like, we're not going to live very long.
Yeah, we don't have much time.
And they didn't even know it. Well, the scientist may have, but Boris didn't.
Yeah. Well, I mean, at that point,
Boris did.
But so what we did not openly tell you as we were going through the episode is that when Ludmilla had her baby, she lived only, I think they said 4 hours in the miniseries, but I saw, well, actually it was in the Lost Tapes, Ludmilla said herself it was more like 5 hours, and her baby died. And she said that she was told by the medical workers that her baby saved her life, that her, she had this extreme exposure to radiation
because
through her husband.
Because she laid with her husband when she wasn't supposed to.
Yep, she was around him so much. And so the baby actually had absorbed all of that radiation. So the baby did not live, but that's why Ludmilla did.
That's so sad.
So sad. The villain that the portrayed villain, yes. Dyatlov. He was sentenced to 10 years of hard labor for criminal mismanagement.
That's rough.
Yes. And during the trial, this is something that came up in the miniseries and also in the sources. He tried to argue he wasn't even there. They said, where are you? And he said, the toilet. But I don't know how he phrased it, but he tried to say he had gone to the bathroom. He tried to remove himself. But then I can't even remember the exact quote. At a different point, he basically did say he had a hand in it. That there wasn't
He probably couldn't avoid it totally.
Right. So, but long story short, sentenced to 10 years of hard labor. He served 3 and then was released early in 1990. They think that his poor health was a factor in them, granting some leniency to him. And he ended up dying of heart failure in 1995, according to the Cosmopolitan article. There's a fella that we have not talked about much in this miniseries, but he comes up a lot in the book. And if you watch the miniseries, he is the leader of the power plant who has the curly hair. You may not remember him if you haven't seen it recently, but he's the fella who basically built the town. And
really?
Yes, he was the one who had this power plant built. So he was behind it all. His name was Viktor Brukhanov, I think. And he really wasn't a scientist. Like, he didn't know all the things about running a nuclear power plant. He knew how to
construct,
build a city, and how to manage and how to organize.
Then what was he doing there?
Well, he was like head of it. He was like management. He was kind of the leader of the whole thing, but he's not a guy who would have been in the room knowing how do I control the rods
reactor
and deal with this situation. Like, that's not where he would have known what to do. But long story short, he acknowledged responsibility, didn't really try to defend himself during the trial. I think he just knew this was how it was going to be. He was sentenced to 10 years at a penal colony in eastern Ukraine, but was released after 5 years. The Cosmo article says it was for good behavior. It went on to say that he lived a pretty reclusive life afterwards, but would occasionally give interviews. And when he did, he would usually come out with the argument that the Soviet authorities had used him and those other fellows they put on trial. Exactly. He would say, we were the fall guys. We were the scapegoats. And the real cause of the Chernobyl disaster was the flaw with these RBMK reactors. Yeah. There was one other fella that was on trial. I have not talked about him hardly at all. His name was Nikolai Fomin. He's in the miniseries. He's the other boss that we see. I couldn't find much on him. He was sentenced, I believe, to 10 years, as the other fellows were. This is sad, but what I did see was that apparently this was very, very traumatic to him. He tried to take his life. I think his trial had to be delayed because of that. And then other times he tried to. I'm not sure exactly what ended up happening with him, but I think he was let out early, as the other fellows were. I heard, don't hold me to this, that one of these three men actually went back and started working at a nuclear power plant later. I believe it would have been Nikolai Fomin, if it were anybody. I don't think it was the other two.
The third guy?
So
yeah.
if there's truth to that, it was probably him.
Okay.
Of course, we've said that the character of Ulana, played by Emily Watson, the female scientist, she was supposed to represent actually these hundreds of other scientists who actually worked on this. So no follow-up, obviously, to her, but something that did come out, and I think we may have even heard a reference to this in one of the little quotes that I played, is the fact that these scientists, they were huge. I mean, not only were they instrumental in containing this disaster that could have just absolutely devastated so much of the world, but they also sometimes risked their lives by putting out some of the truths or pushing on things that had been kept hidden, that were secret. And so they are given so much credit for making a difference. And ultimately, it took a while, but ultimately the other nuclear reactors in this country were finally fixed.
Thank goodness.
But you would think that would happen immediately, but no, it didn't. No. It took a while.
I think to fix it, you have to admit there's a problem, and they didn't want to do that.
Yeah. Yes. One interesting side note, I saw this in more than one article, but it's an opinion type thing. So I don't know that there's a yes, that's correct, or no, it's not. But it was just something that was said in a few different articles that they think, some people believe, that the accident at Chernobyl was actually a big factor in the fall of the Soviet Union.
Really?
Yes, that the fact that the deception's getting out, things being exposed like this, the public trust in the government
would have been destroyed,
eroding, that this was one of the big things that actually led to that happening.
Interesting.
Armchair psychologist.
Well, this has been a lot.
It has been a lot.
And I have actually two armchair questions to throw at you.
You're going to do a double arm.
Okay.
Double barrel.
Get ready. So the first one, you actually segued into it just a minute ago.
Look at me go.
You talked about the deceptions.
Yeah.
That was a huge theme in this miniseries. In fact, I think it was Valerie who poses the question, what is the cost of lies?
Oh, yeah.
So thinking about that as a key theme of this miniseries, what are you thinking about the role that lies and deception plays within this tragedy?
The lies cost lives. Because, like I just said, the longer that you deny there is a problem, the longer you delay in fixing it, and the more lives are impacted. I was just thinking about the women with the wool that you were talking about. They were not in that area, but it was wool. How much of that wool got sent out? And then people who wore that wool or dealt with that wool, there's now radiation in there. How many products came?
Right.
The impact is just innumerable.
Right.
And if they had just told the truth up front and taken accountability, whoever it was, government, the mustache man, whoever, just get to it and stop trying to save your own hide. And look at the damage that was done. Look at what destruction. That's the real disaster and destruction, is not the real one, but you know what I mean? Like the lies and the lives that were lost by not taking accountability.
Absolutely. And think about the fact that the only reason they owned up to it was because radiation was detected in the neighboring countries.
Yeah.
What could have happened?
They would have denied it.
And think about, it was on the verge of getting so much worse. And here you might be living over here in Scandinavia and you have no idea that your very existence is in danger. Just absolute craziness. Well, a second question I was going to ask you.
Well, what's your answer to it? You give me these thesis, like doctorate level questions. Here, Ashley, tell me the meaning of life and have no time to think about it. I will move on to the next question without answering.
I think it undergirds everything. I think it is such a domino effect.
Yeah, that's a good word.
Because every single little domino that falls leads to something else. And
worse. Leads to something worse.
Like even Ludmilla. Yes, they said to her, don't spend time in that room.
But they didn't say why.
Right. Yes. Everywhere you went. The later, when people who knew they had been exposed to radiation would go to doctors and say, this is happening to me. I know that I've been exposed and here's my sickness. And instead of being treated, they're being told you have radiophobia. I mean, it is in every level of this. I don't even know where to begin. Yeah.
It's horrid.
Right. Yes. So if this was their big theme, they nailed it because it's there. It is everywhere. Well, my other question relates to a different thing that we've discussed several times. We've talked about where did they adhere to historical accuracy? Where were there places where they went into historical fiction? And it was interesting because I even noticed as we were listening to one of those clips from Craig Mazin, who was the creator and writer, he even used the term historical fiction at one point, which is interesting because a lot of times they won't use the term historical fiction. They'll just say based on. But the fact that he used that term made me think, okay, so there are places where he knew.
Well, the scientists for one thing.
Right. Yes. But my point is, what are your thoughts about how it worked? The places where they took liberties with the truth versus sticking strictly to it. Like, do you think they were successful?
I think that they were. And I've talked about it a couple times, the story that my mom, Rebecca, and I wrote about the Radium Woman, the play. You have to do that. This is a story, the one that we wrote took over 15 years, and we were trying to get something in 2 hours that took over 15 years. In some cases, we had to compact characters, and we were as historically accurate as we could be with the women's personalities. But in the timeline, we had to collapse some things. And we also tried to do it in the same year that it happened, but sometimes I'd pick dates out of somebody's birthday in my family, do it that day because we didn't have a date or we needed it to be this particular time. But we tried to do it as accurately as we could, but it's just impossible.
In order to tell a tightly woven story, sometimes you just had to fill in the gaps. Yeah,
and I feel bad for the women. In our case, there were many, many more workers. We only concentrated on like 7 or so, and there was 15 in the story. We had to cut half of them out just immediately.
Because there's no way to do it.
Yeah, there was
Narrative
no way.
Economy.
There was no way. So I'm sure the people that were in this story thought, well, what about my story? Isn't it important? Yes, it absolutely is. And hopefully one day someone else will take up the mantle and tell your story, another storyteller. But to tell the one he wanted to tell, this is what he had to do.
But that's where I'm going to give him a kudos because I touched on this before. I will say it again. Because he did such a wonderful job, such a compelling job telling the story as accurately as he could, as much detail as he could, even though some liberties were taken, he inspired people like me, and I know I'm one of many, to go find out more.
Yeah.
I mean, this is why you have so many people who are now going and taking tours of the actual site of Chernobyl.
I don't know that I would do that, though.
Well,
I would be a little nervous.
I think that, it's happening a lot. I think it's safer now. As we said, some people are living there. But
I would take a virtual tour.
Yes. Safety would be a concern.
Yeah.
But people are pursuing it. People are now much more interested. They're finding out the truth. They're reading the books. They're watching the documentaries. They're looking at the actual first-person accounts where you have primary source documents, right? Where hopefully you are getting it the way it was, or at least the way it was according to this person's perspective.
Right.
Now, on the flip side, I'm telling you, it was pretty amazing looking at those lost tape documents. I'm going to give you the example of when they had those thousands of men, because I do believe they were all men that they had do this, the liquidators who had the job of going up and running out on the rooftop, to physically remove the graphite and other radioactive material. You see it, because here's the thing, I don't think I said this. On those videotapes.
The lost tapes?
The lost tapes. They make the comment that the party, the state, wanted to record everything. They kept very close documentation because I think they thought, first of all, we're going to prove what we did, or we're going to prove how well we dealt with it. But they thought this would be used to their benefit. Of course, it was kept out of the public eye forever and ever and ever. But they recorded things. So you're seeing this actual footage. And when I was watching how it actually happened, and thinking about the way it looked in that miniseries, other scenes in the hospital, like scenes from the hospital. I mean, there were so many different places where I was like, they recreated this.
Yeah.
They really did recreate this just the way it looked. One comment was sometimes down to the shoelace.
That's amazing.
Yes. just unbelievable. So I so respect, so appreciate that attention to detail.
That's a
and
lot
the
of
fact
work.
that he was as accurate as he could be historically when he could. Yeah. And I think where he took the liberties, it worked.
He had to.
All right. Well, that brings us to the end of part 2. Who are we going to cheers?
Oh, who would you like to cheers? You've been the one that's really been gung-ho about this. We cheersed the creator in the first half. Who would you like to do this time?
The liquidators.
Okay.
The people who did step up and risk their lives and everything, just sacrificed it all to help because they knew they felt like it was the right thing to do and they knew they were helping people. So cheers to them.
Absolutely. Cheers.
Cheers. If you love what we do, please rate and review our show or become a supporter through Buy Me a Coffee or Patreon. Whether a single gift or recurring monthly donation, your support is what allows us to keep the tea brewing.
Subscribe on your favorite podcast app or the Scandal Water Podcast YouTube channel. And follow us on Facebook, Instagram, and TikTok. Show notes are available at our website, scandalwaterpodcast.com, where you can also access the merch store and more.
This episode was executive produced by Candy Thomas, that's me, and Ashley Raymer Brown.
That's me.
It was researched and written by Candy Thomas and edited by Ashley Raymer Brown.
A special thank you to Josh Martin, who wrote, composed, and performed the Scandal Water theme and other music. Matt C. Adams, who created the artwork, and Joshua Reith, who designed our website and provides ongoing technical support.
As a reminder, this podcast is purely for entertainment purposes. The thoughts and opinions of the host during each episode of Scandal Water are their own and do not reflect the opinions of any future guests, advertisers, or clearly professional psychologists. Thanks for listening.